For decades, doctors, nurses, and family members have reported mysterious scenes in the final hours of elderly individuals. Many describe the patient's eyes fixed on an empty spot in the room as if they were seeing something that others cannot. Others begin speaking with deceased loved ones as if they were right there waiting for them. Science tries to explain it as hallucinations, but there are patterns that repeat too often to be ignored. Dolores Cannon, who investigated hundreds of accounts through regression, revealed that the moments preceding death are more conscious than many imagine. According to her, the spirit begins to gently detach itself before the body stops functioning. The elderly person is still there, but already beginning to experience glimpses of what's to come. What do they see? Where are they looking? Why do some crack a smile even without strength? In this video, we'll explore these questions based on the accounts she gathered over years of research. To the eyes of the observer, everything seems silent and frail. But within the mind of the departing, something powerful happens. Dolores describes that, in the final minutes, the elderly person begins to perceive subtle presences in the environment. Some report seeing a soft light, while others feel a peace so intense that fear disappears. It's as if the suffering completely recedes and is replaced by serene clarity. This isn't just a belief, but a pattern described by dozens of people who have had near-death experiences. If this topic interests you, subscribe to the channel and give it a thumbs up. Many elderly people who have returned from these experiences have reported being greeted by deceased relatives, religious figures, or even beings of light. This final phase, according to Cannon, isn't random. It's the moment when the soul prepares for the transition, even before the body says goodbye. There's a case that Cannon often narrates. A 79-year-old woman, hospitalized with an irreversible condition, asked the staff to leave the window open. She said that her husband was outside waiting for her. The family thought it was delirium, but the woman repeated with conviction, "He's calling me." Hours later, she passed away with a faint smile on her face. The most curious thing was the nurse's account, who swore she felt a slight chill in the room minutes before the death. Situations like this occur in various places around the world, transcending cultures and religions. This raises a question. What really happens behind the scenes at the end of life? Dolores claims that the soul, in its final moments, begins to review scenes from its own history, as if it were closing cycles. These reviews don't occur in a confused way. On the contrary, many describe memories emerging with clarity. These aren't random images, but moments of emotional significance, a reconciliation that remained pending, a gesture that was remarkable, a hug that wasn't repeated. Everything returns gently, not as guilt but as understanding. For Cannon, this process is natural. The conscious mind may no longer be active, but the soul remains lucid. Many elderly people enter a state of deep calm, as if they were already on another plane. The heartbeat slows down, the eyes lose focus, but the spiritual presence intensifies. This transition is silent, but full of meaning. It's when the body gives way for the invisible to manifest. Another point that Dolores highlights is that the presence of loved ones in the room influences this process. Many elderly people report feeling an impulse to continue when they hear familiar voices. But there's also the opposite. When they realize that everyone is at peace, the body seems to allow itself to leave. It's not uncommon for an elderly person to resist for hours until a child arrives or someone says in a low voice that it's okay if they want to rest. And then, a few minutes later, the final sigh happens. This suggests that there's a deep connection between the mind, affection, and the spirit. For Cannon, the spirit understands when it's time to go and only waits for the most serene moment to let go. There's no drama, just surrender. She also mentions that many elderly people report feeling that they are being pulled out of their bodies by something light and welcoming. It's as if a gentle force envelops them, without pain, without fear, just a calm displacement. They say they observe their own body from above, as if they were saying goodbye with gratitude. In these experiences, there's almost always a feeling of being welcomed. No one reports darkness or terror. Most speak of light, of warmth, of familiarity. Cannon suggests that this is part of the natural process of the soul, which already knows the way. It's like returning to a familiar place after a long journey. And perhaps for those on the outside, this is the true mystery of the end. Not death itself, but what it reveals about the continuity of life. In many of the accounts analyzed by Dolores, there was a common point. Time seemed to slow down in the final minutes. It didn't matter if the room was full of people or in complete silence. The elderly people reported feeling that everything around them lost urgency. It was as if the mind entered a different frequency, slower and clearer. In these hours, perceptions emerged that weren't there before. Some heard soft music that didn't come from any device. Others smelled old perfumes, linked to childhood memories. For Dolores, this was a sign that the soul was beginning to expand, accessing dimensions that go beyond the physical. The elderly person, still conscious or not, was already in contact with a broader field of reality. This transition for her wasn't an abrupt break, but a gradual passage, as natural as waking up from a dream. Dolores also mentions the phenomenon of the tunnel of light, so often cited by people who have had near-death experiences. According to her studies, many elderly people say they see this tunnel minutes before passing away, even without ever having heard of it before. It's described as an elongated space with golden or white light, which transmits a profound feeling of peace. There are reports of people who saw familiar faces in this tunnel, reaching out, smiling, as if they were ready to welcome them. At no point does fear appear. What is repeated is the feeling of relief, of lightness. For Dolores, this tunnel isn't a metaphor, but a real perception of the soul leaving the limits of the body. Although science cannot measure it, its emotional and spiritual impact is very consistent among the accounts. One aspect that is rarely talked about, but recurrent in Dolores' studies, is the sparkle in the eyes. Nurses and caregivers report that, at certain moments, the eyes of the elderly gain a different shine. Even when they can no longer speak, there's a firm look full of meaning. Sometimes it's accompanied by a faint smile or a single tear. Dolores considers this a kind of silent communication. The soul, about to depart, tries to transmit something to those who remain. It can be gratitude, it can be a final goodbye, it can just be the certainty that everything will be okay. This sparkle doesn't last long. Soon the eyes close, the body becomes still. But those who witness it never forget. It's a brief moment, but full of presence. A moment in which the invisible touches the visible. For many family members, this brings comfort. Knowing that the elderly person didn't leave alone, nor in suffering, changes the whole perspective on death. Dolores highlights that understanding these signs helps to alleviate grief. When we know that there's an internal preparation, a conscious surrender, we can better accept the farewell. Death ceases to be a shock and becomes seen as a natural stage of life. Of course, the pain of absence remains, but it's accompanied by a type of peace, the same peace that, according to many accounts, the elderly person felt before leaving. This transforms the way we face the end, not as failure, but as return. And understanding this, especially in old age, can bring more serenity to our own process of living. Dolores always insisted that the soul is never lost. Even in the most delicate cases, such as sudden deaths or comatose states, she said that the spirit knows exactly what's happening. In her regression sessions, people reported remembering with clarity the moments of their own death. They described where they were, who was by their side, what they felt. And they always mentioned the same feeling, being welcomed. This reinforces the idea that there's no abandonment. The soul is supported by something greater, which goes beyond human understanding. For those watching from the outside, it may seem like an end. But for those living it from the inside, it's the beginning of something new. Dolores affirmed that this transition is more like a return than a definitive farewell. Another remarkable account involves an 84-year-old man who spent his last days in a nursing home. He said every morning that he had dreamed of a garden where he reunited with his wife, who had passed away years before. He described the place in detail: flowering trees, a wooden bench, singing birds. On the day of his death, he reported having dreamed that she finally called him by name. He woke up smiling, asked for coffee, and hours later passed away peacefully. The doctor in charge reported that he rarely saw such a serene death. Dolores considered these dreams a preparation of the spirit. The unconscious begins to work on detachment, creating images that facilitate the passage. For her, dreams aren't just symbolic, but true encounters with what is to come. In the moments leading up to death, silence takes on an essential role. Many healthcare professionals report that when everything around calms down, the elderly person seems to enter a state of deep introspection. The heartbeat becomes rhythmic, the breathing slows down, and there's a stillness in the air that seems to hold something sacred. Dolores observed that in these hours, the spirit is in full activity, even if the body is still. It's a silence full of presence, not absence. There's something happening there, beyond what the eyes can capture. It's not uncommon for family members to feel taken by a sense of reverence, as if they were standing before something much greater. And indeed they are. For Dolores, it's the moment when the soul begins to free itself from the shackles of time and space. This process doesn't have a fixed script. Each soul lives its transition in a unique way, but the patterns repeat with surprising consistency. Dolores believed that, in the final moments, the elderly person feels an expansion of consciousness. It's as if everything that has been lived gains meaning in seconds. Guilt loses strength, fears dissolve, and what remains is the essence of what was really worthwhile: love, bonds, learnings. This state of clarity is described by many as a serene revelation. There's no regret but understanding, and this understanding opens the way for peaceful detachment. The body is still present, but the soul has already begun its journey. Death, in this context, isn't interruption, it's continuity. Dolores also observed that some elderly people described hearing gentle voices, as if someone were calling them in a loving way. These voices didn't cause fear. On the contrary, they brought calm. They were like invitations, not orders. In some cases, they were accompanied by images, such as fields, old houses, or even childhood scenes. For her, these were signs that the soul was already being guided to a familiar environment. This familiarity diminished fear and facilitated surrender. Even those who were unconscious seemed to react to these experiences with more serene expressions on their faces. The muscles relaxed, the breathing became light. It was as if the body understood that everything was okay, that it was safe to leave. There are also accounts of changes in the environment. Dolores received dozens of descriptions from family members who felt the atmosphere of the room change moments before death. The air seemed lighter, the light seemed softer. Some said they felt a sudden floral scent. Others perceived a sudden warmth on the skin, nothing that could be explained physically. For her, these were subtle manifestations of spiritual presence. The soul, when detaching itself, affects the surrounding environment, not in a scary way, but as a wave of peace. These details, although discreet, deeply mark those who witness them. They aren't collective hallucinations. They are testimonies of something that goes beyond the material and touches the spiritual with delicacy. In many of the documented accounts, the elderly person didn't seem to fight against death. There was a progressive acceptance, as if something inside said that the time had been fulfilled. Dolores believed that this acceptance came from the soul, which, upon recognizing the end of a cycle, no longer resisted. The body may even try to maintain vital functions for some time, but the spirit was already in another state. This difference between body and soul was evident in the last breaths. The body seemed heavy, but the environment gained a lightness difficult to explain. It's as if the person's essence was no longer there, even though the body was still breathing. This, for Dolores, was proof that the spirit remains conscious, even after detachment. In her studies, she also identified that how the elderly person lived directly impacts their experience of death. People who cultivated deep emotional bonds and a more peaceful view of life tend to have smoother transitions. Those who accumulated a lot of resentment or fear often face more resistance when leaving. However, even in these cases, the soul finds its way. Dolores said that there is no lost soul, only souls that take longer to accept the process. But all without exception are supported. There's always something or someone waiting on the other side. This certainty, according to her, should bring comfort not only to those who leave, but also to those who stay. In the hypnosis sessions conducted by Dolores, some souls reported that, after leaving the body, they went through a kind of reception. There was no judgment or fear. It was like arriving home after a long absence. There were welcoming, but not imposing, presences. The soul was free to observe, understand, accept. Often this involved a reunion with spiritual guides or with important people from their journey. Dolores explained that this didn't happen by chance. It was a prepared process, like a silent welcoming ceremony. This initial stage served for the soul to understand what had ended and what opened from then on. Time, as we know it, no longer mattered. The focus now was consciousness, in its broadest form. For those who stay, understanding this passage as a process and not as an absolute loss can change everything. Dolores insisted that death isn't a break, but a transition of form. The elderly person who leaves doesn't cease to exist. They only cease to occupy the physical space. Memory, affection, learnings remain present in the lives of those who stayed, and according to many accounts, the spiritual bond remains active. Some say they feel the presence of the loved one days later. A smell, a sudden memory, a feeling of companionship. For Dolores, this isn't illusion. It's the spirit manifesting in a subtle way to say that it's okay, and that it continues to accompany even from a distance. In one of her books, Dolores shares the account of a daughter who spent days beside her hospitalized mother, not knowing if she could hear. On the last day, while stroking her hand, she whispered that everything was okay and that she loved her. The mother, who hadn't spoken in days, gently squeezed her hand and soon after passed away. For the daughter, this gesture was the confirmation that there was consciousness there, that her mother's soul heard, understood, and waited for that moment. Dolores used this example to show that even in silence, the spirit communicates. We just have to be attentive. The love that manifests in this instant is as true as any word said in life. That's why she recommended that people talk to their loved ones until the end, that they express feelings, even if there's no apparent response. The soul listens, the spirit perceives. Words spoken with truth cross any physical barrier, and this not only helps those who are leaving, but also brings relief to those who stay. Knowing that they were able to say something important, even belatedly, can transform grief into living memory. Dolores said that death doesn't end love. It only changes its form of presence, and it's in this understanding that we find strength to move forward with more lightness, even in the face of absence. What the elderly see before dying, according to Dolores, is more than visions. They are real spiritual perceptions, which reveal the beginning of a new stage. They don't leave in the dark. They are guided by memories, by affections, by subtle presences that comfort them. The experience of death, when understood without fear, can teach us a lot about life, about what really matters, about what we leave in each gesture, and about how we want to be remembered. Knowing that there's something beyond the last breath invites us to live with more meaning now, and to take care of our bonds with more attention and tenderness, because in the end, that's what remains. If this video brought clarity or comfort to you, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing it with someone who needs to hear this today. What we explored here isn't just a reflection on death, but an invitation to value every moment of life with more awareness. The accounts of Dolores Cannon remind us that the end isn't an abyss but a passage, and that how we live directly influences the way we leave. By better understanding this process, we can welcome with more serenity both our losses and our own path. And so we continue living, knowing that nothing that was lived with love is lost.